none other than Jeremy Hoyle, and he joins us live in the studio right now. Good morning, Jeremy, or Jez, or JH, or what?
Yeah, got a couple of monikers there. Anything will do. Jez is fine.
Cool, man. I thought I'd be professional enough and put Jeremy Hoyle up there just to show that we are somewhat professional in here. Good morning to you, man. How are you?
Yeah, good. Got to say, I'm getting up early today because with the kids home from school in our COVID lockdown, life starts pretty late in the mornings for the last couple of weeks. So this is an early one for me.
Yeah, nice, man. Nice. How many kids you got?
Two girls, two teenagers, both in high school. So they get up, 5 minutes before school starts and pretend they've been in the shower. Typical stuff. What you'd expect from those kids in their mid-teens. They live up to it.
I haven't spoken to you, obviously, for obvious reasons, but you immigrated here from Wales. You got no Wales accent going on here.
I was pretty young. I'm really Australian, although I still only have a British passport. I've got stupid stories about never quite getting Australian citizenship, but I should have got it. There was a time when having an EU passport was worthwhile as well, being a British citizen. That's obviously in the future a pretty pointless and useless thing. So, I sort of just kept it because it was quite handy for getting around. But came here when I was 5, lived in Australia for most of my life, had a brief stint living over in Germany with my fiance. Actually, we've been engaged for, I think it's 15 years now.
Oh, congratulations for being engaged.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Sounds really encouraging. Engaged for 15 years, yeah.
Yeah, just making sure that we're right for each other before we get married. Over to Germany for a couple of years because she's from a German background, and eventually decided, let's go back to Australia if we're going to do a family, which we wanted to do. This would be felt like a better place to do that. So that was around 2001. A few years over there, back here, sort of mid 2000s, and then back into life in Australia. So I'm pretty much Australian, even though I was born over in Wales.
Yeah, cool. And you got a couple of similarities with Daz. You got a bit of a BMX, background. We all think we were pretty handy on the BMX. Were you just a little notch above everyone else?
No. I think one of the things that I've done really well in my life is perform to a mediocre level, exceptionally well. Occasionally done worse, but I'd like to say I'm reasonably good at being mediocre. I usually have a BMX sitting here behind me, actually.
Right.
30-year anniversary Haro freestyler that Daz knows about. But that whole skate thing and BMX thing in the 80s, that was a real big thing. I started racing in the early 80s. Did pretty well, actually, local scene, and then got into freestyle in the later 80s, and then went off to uni at the beginning of the 90s. So
I love it.
Probably had about 10 years on BMXs, but 35 years probably on bikes. Always on a bike if I can do it.
Yeah, right. Broken bones, what's going on? Collarbones, wrists, forearms?
No, not so many. I was pretty fortunate. I did a lot of years of gymnastics. So when I crashed, I used to instinctively tumble fairly well. Yeah. So I'd come out of it reasonably well off, often with a broken bike. In pre and skate bowl, I broke the back end of a bike going into the bowl, dropped the whatever it was 8 feet into the concrete, and just rolled through it. And everyone thought I jumped off the bike and rolled through. And then we picked up the bike and it was like, no, it broke. So yeah, I've been kind of fortunate with injury, not too many bad ones. Did more broken bones when I was, probably between the ages of 8 and 12. And then after that, they didn't come so frequently.
Oh man, you just got to learn to stop, drop and roll. I knew stop, drop and roll had some kind of influence other than dodging fires in the world.
Yeah, I should do an illustration of that. It would be quite an interesting variation on the theme. Right?
Stop, drop and roll off your bike or your skateboard.
Into a concrete skateboard.
Yeah, man. Sounds fun. You got a cool child. I always envy kids that kind of got really, really into the cool things. When we all had skateboards, we all gave it a go. But I mean, there's a real subculture there going on, and we get to hear about it a bit about Daz. And I know another guy through Daz, Jamie, on from my cafe world, who's just obsessed with BMXs and still keeps one, and he's always got one or two just in primo nick and just takes photos of it up on Instagram every now and then. Like it's his love. Yeah,
no, they're beautiful objects as well. But that whole period through the 80s with the racing and then freestyle and skate was all in together, mixed in with a lot of hip hop. So we were doing graffiti and breakdancing and all that kind of stuff. It was just, you look back at it and that mix of everything we had going on was pretty mega. And you see a lot of people obviously reproducing that and have been since. but there was something about it because it was a discovery thing. And I lived out in the country, out in East Gippsland, which is about 250 k's east of Melbourne.
Yeah.
And so getting access to stuff out there, we had 2 TV channels. We were lucky. We lived in a gap. Well, there's a gap between the mountains where the signal would come through from Melbourne, so we could pick up the Melbourne stations, which I think gave us 5 stations. So you'd occasionally see that stuff on Saturday morning TV, or that kind of thing. And then Rage started up, I think, through the late 80s, somewhere around there. So we'd get that music, but it was really hard to find. We actually had to drive up to Melbourne and find the record stores like Central Station in the city and other places. And we had this route that we planned out where we go hit this BMX shop and then hit that record shop and, do all this sort of stuff when we're up for a day. Sometimes coming up on the old Red Rattler train in the late 70s, but the Gippsland trains in the 80s. And you had to be really coordinated. You had to know what you were going to do and what was going to happen. And you had to stick to your timetable to go and get everything done. I think it was an early discipline thing that carried over into later life.
Oh, that's good, man. It seems like you had a really cool career. I mean, things are going pretty swimmingly in your life. I'm sure you could pick on little things there as just being an Aussie battler. But 2017, you come across something that no one wants to ever admit to themselves that they've got, and you get diagnosed with cancer. How did that come about?
Interesting story. A couple of months ago, maybe 6 months before that, a close workmate and a good friend now had dropped dead in the gym from a heart attack. They'd resuscitated him. He'd had surgery and come back to life, and he's still kicking around, which is great. Wow. And so I had a heart attack very much on my mind as part of being alive and being our age.
Yeah.
And I had these chest pains and a pain through my arm one morning, and I was sitting there going, I had a job where I was doing stupid long hours, right? It was far away. I was commuting. And I had this real panic that I was actually having a heart attack. So that all settled down, came up again about an hour later, and my wife's like, call an ambulance. I'm like, nah, I can tell it wasn't quite that serious, but it wasn't good. Went to my GP, got in there at 9:30 that morning. She checked me all out and said, well, good news, you haven't had a heart attack, but I don't like the look of that mole on your cheek. And I knew about this mole. It'd been there for a while. This is the stereotypical story, right? I knew I needed to go get it checked out properly, and I hadn't done it.
Yeah.
So she looked at it, she checked it out with her kit that they use, the GPs use, and she rang her skin specialist who was heading to Europe for 4 weeks the next day and said, I need you to see him this morning. I'm thinking, okay, all right. This sounds a bit more serious than I thought it was. Duh. And so over to him, and by 12:30, I was back home with a bunch of stitches in my face down on this side of my face here, and it had been removed. 24 hours later, I got a call back from the nurses there with my pathology results, and it was one of those you're sitting down moments.
Oh, makes you feel sick.
So yeah, this is early, sort of 9 o'clock the next morning straight. First phone call for the day before them probably. And they said, and this might not be exactly how it happened, but basically you've got a pretty well advanced melanoma. It's quite a serious one. This is usually diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. All right, okay, stage 4, that can't be bad, right? Because it's probably 10 stages, so, I'll be right.
Yeah.
This shows you, I think the thing was, this was a huge learning curve. I really knew nothing about cancer, even having lost friends and family friends and things, so I really didn't know what happened with it. So I rang my dad, who's a GP, and I grew up in a family of GPs and doctors, and this is the worst thing I did. I rang him and told him, because I was thinking, you tell me what it is, and he just lost it. Angry with me because I hadn't done anything about this mole, and he knew about this mole. It'd been there, it had changed over 6 months to 12 months. So all the indications were I did the typical stupid thing. So for your listeners, if there's anything you can learn, if you see a mole that's even vaguely suspect, go get the thing checked out, because it happens really quickly.
Everyone says that goes through your situation or a little scare, go just rip it out, go check it out.
It's absolute garbage. And I think if COVID's taught us anything at all, it's that you're not too busy to do things.
Yes.
So this is before that, of course, and I learned this the hard way. So, I didn't talk to my dad about it again after that. In fact, I would only give him reports about how I was going with progress. And in fact, part of the treatment process is they don't really tell you anything. I'm fine with that. I've been around doctors and nurses and surgeons and anaesthetists and you name it for my whole life. So I know why they don't do it. And so talking to the people at the hospital, actually what happened next was I went back to my GP the next couple of days later just to have everything checked out, make sure that stitches were good and all that kind of stuff. And she said, I'm going to refer you to Peter Mac. So Peter Mccallum Cancer Centre, for those people who haven't heard about it, probably one of the global leaders. It is one of the global leaders for cancer treatment. So it's close by for me, probably more of a proximity thing than a seriousness thing, I guess. But either way, I knew about the centre and it was like, okay, right, so that must mean something. And, then I was back to work the next week. So I had a couple of days off in that window and back to work. And that's when the whole thing started to sort of hit me, because obviously I had to deal with it. I didn't know what was going on from that, having had the melanoma removed, whether I would be okay, whether that was it, whether it had gone further. At the time, been a fairly lifelong Hawthorn Football Club supporter. Jared Ruffhead had gone through a run-in with melanoma on his lip.
That's right.
Much more serious, as it turns out, than I went through, but you don't know these things at the time. And had a relapse around the same time. We're actually both being treated there at the same time. Never got to see him, unfortunately, sort of. But, very much top of mind because of, following the news.
Sure.
So, and then it was a fairly long wait until Peter Mac called me to get me in there. And that was a weird thing too, because, you've got weeks and weeks and weeks, as it turns out, of waiting. No news, just thoughts in your head bouncing around about how far this could be. Is it down to my toes? Is it in my lungs? Where is it? What's it doing? And how fast does it move? Some cancers can move pretty quickly. Some are, slower, but we know melanoma, at least most Australians know melanoma is fairly serious. Even though the treatment rates here are exceptional, it's not something you want to have. So, waited around, actually ended up calling Peter Mac because I hadn't heard anything. And my first bit of good news, and there were little snippets of good news on the way through for the whole thing, was they said, well, we tend to call people on the seriousness of their cases. So if you haven't been called, then the team they've seen everything, they've assessed it,
right,
and they've deemed it as, a certain level of seriousness, and then you haven't been called. So that was on a Friday afternoon. I gave those guys a call. On Monday, Peter Mac called me back and said, right, we need to get you in.
What changed?
So nothing. I just happened to call them, and, it turned out that was about a normal waiting period for people that they want to see reasonably quickly. And just that's the time frame that this stuff sort of panned out to be. So going from having just sitting there alone with my thoughts, trying to get through work on a daily basis, long commutes with nothing else in my head, finally getting some action going. And those points worked out to be highlights, to be honest. Anyone who's going through treatment, when you actually go into treatment and something happens, at least from my point of view, they're really positive things because you are doing something. It's the waiting in between that's the killer. That's the thing that mentally kicks you. When you've got time to think about what's going to go wrong. I wasn't particularly worried about if it got me and if I died from it. I was worried about my family.
I'm thinking of your family right now immediately, going, what are they up to? Sometimes it's annoying when people are going, what's going on? Just shush. I'm trying to deal with it, but it's a natural interest. They want to know, but no one knows. It's heavy.
Well, the company that I was working for at the time were absolutely freaking brilliant, and we had in that particular group of people, we even when I was there working for them, we had one person who passed away from cancer. We had another couple who had diagnoses. One of my former colleagues is fighting for her life at the moment. It's just, I think you get to a certain age and it becomes a bit more prevalent anyway. I'm in my 50s now, so that, it starts to happen. Went to a wake of a friend 4 weeks ago, who didn't make it. So it just becomes, it's around you. It's part of what you see. And then if you're one of the people in it, it changes how you think and feel, and it becomes quite overwhelming at times. So for me, I had a kind of a fortunate thing. I don't want to talk too much and bore people, but my whole episode was kind of in and out fairly quickly. The whole period of my treatment was just over 3 months because, as it turned out, like its owner, my cancer was lazy. It had really well developed in my face, but hadn't really got out of bed and gone for a run.
Right.
Like me, it's never going to happen. So I went into Peter Mac, they checked over my numbers, and my oncologist, the head oncologist there I was talking to, looked at all of my numbers on my paper and he goes, oh, there's a good number here. I'm like, yeah, there's a good number there. And it was the how far the cancer had spread. So it's mitosis, how much it was reproducing and moving out. He said it's very low. So I'd gone from facing a potential sort of 10% life expectancy over 5-year kind of numbers, with the other pathology down to, oh, well, this has flipped it on its head. So they had to go in, do another surgery, take more skin out because I hadn't had enough taken out to be up to standard for a removal.
Right.
Just something my skin specialist had said, look, I'll do the minimum. There'll be more to come from this. You'll have to, we'll probably have to fix this up later. Yeah, fine. So I went in, had another surgery, and they did a biopsy and went into my neck and took out some lymph nodes, which was the likely pathway this little cancer would take out of my face. So I had that biopsy. I got results back, and they said, look, it has moved. If you imagine a sort of a P, put a dot on it with a Sharpie marker. That's what we found in the sentinel node. So in your first node that it probably would have got to. That's actually quite good because it means it hasn't moved further. It's not in the other two. So I'd gone from being, prepped up for everything from chemo, radio, all of the various options that were there to, we reckon we might be able to treat this with surgery. And that's about 3% of cases. So it's like, okay, the numbers are all shifting. They're flipping over as I go through this process. This is every couple of weeks you're getting this update of information. So your head's just going all over the place from this is the worst thing to, oh, maybe I'm going to get out of this okay, and back and forth in between. So eventually I went in for my major surgery, which was what they call a parotidectomy. There's a saliva gland in the side of your cheek, which is called the parotid gland, which produces a lot of saliva. And then you've got lymph nodes in your neck. So I've had all of those. I've got a scar that runs down from here. Goes under
see it, man. It's chunky.
Did a great job. I had, the day of the surgery, they had a team of 12 people there, plastic surgeons and neurosurgeon, because it's around facial nerves. So they've got to have people there's only like half a dozen people who are licensed to do this kind of surgery. And then they give you by the way, did you tell you could get facial paralysis from the surgery? As I'm being rolled in on the bed, right?
Get out.
And I'm like Sylvester Stallone style stuff, because he's pretty cool, right? I grew up in the 80s, Sly's one of my heroes. And as it turns out, I've got minor facial paralysis on one side of my face. I've got no feeling down here, which makes it really weird to shave and, wear certain clothes. And all of that sensation refers different ways. Pain in my head and pain down my neck and through to my back, but I've got no feeling where it happens. And also I sweat whenever I eat because I've got no saliva glands. So those signals are all going, ooh, make saliva. And the sweat glands go, well, no one else is here, we'll take over. And so I have to mop my face as I eat, which is kind of a weird thing. Unknown sort of side effects that came out of it. But
Pavarotti used to have this.
But just there.
Just the other side.
So there was a unexpected side effect, but I was really lucky, man. I think I wrote that I dodged a bullet, and it was literally, that's what it was. This thing got cut out, everything got cut out. They created what they called a fire road, around it, fire break. And I was sent home. Went back in 3 months later for scanning, and nothing showed up. So I was doing that for several years afterwards, a normal process. And that was that was okay. The first year was a bit weird, a bit floaty, just not really knowing what anything was anymore, just having been really upended by the whole process, because it was literally like a king hit, I didn't get a long time going through it. There was not a lot of dealing with it. I was literally in and out, and then I was on my own.
What do they say when they send you home?
Well, funnily enough, basically my surgeon was looking in his little book, and he goes, well, your pathologies are completely clear, and closed the little book up and said, off you go, head home, we'll contact you and get you in 3 months. And this is the thing, right? For most people, you'd expect this to be that's the best news in the world, and you would go out and party, right?
Yeah.
And I sort of went, okay, all right, and went home. And my wife was obviously very relieved by this stage. It's the only time she cried through the whole process was when she was with me and they gave me that news. I still looked like a Frankenstein. I had 140 something staples and stitches down here. I had bags on my hip and drains coming out of my neck and all that kind of stuff. I looked like I'd been through a pretty nasty sort of affair. So I didn't look right to her, but of course I didn't see that. And then it was okay, I come back in 3 months. So then you have this 3 month wait to find out whether this stuff has gone any further, because you've been told you're probably likely clear, but you don't know. And that's what it was like after that. It was every 3 months going in. And in between that, I had an overlap. So I was doing a scan, and then I was doing a surgical. So it was literally every 6 weeks I was in there and having something done. So they do surgical checks on you as well as the ongoing cancer scanning. So you never get away from it. It's always over your shoulder, and it's then that idea that it's there, it's lurking, it's hiding. And I think this is the bit that talking with Daz, who was in hospital as well, as he, can be at times. Both of us lying there, chatting away through Messenger about how we feel about things, what all this means.
Yeah.
For him, it's we know it's a longer term issue to deal with. And sorry, I've got a cat there.
Oh, I saw a blur. You don't want to blur it out, but the cat's still got it. It's great.
Yeah, there's a couple of them around. And talking to him made a huge difference to me getting through that sort of first period, because I'd gone from really not having too much to care about on issues like that to then having to deal with it at the time. But it was more of the after effects, what it did to me psychologically, and it brought up a whole bunch of other things about how I deal with things. One of the things I'd learned from my family and my dad, particularly in times of crisis, accidents, was I dealt with them in a medical professional kind of way, because that's what I'd learned. There was never any panic. It was always emotionless response, deal with the situation. And I'd been around serious accidents, people being killed and various other things that I'd had happen to me at various stages in my life, and just could manage all of that as a medical professional, because I've been trained to do it since I was a little kid.
Yeah.
Fell off my bike. Then
I can imagine even the way you are now. I can imagine you going, yes, this is going to happen, and then on we go. But so you weren't ever the subject in that commentary.
And honestly, it's not a good way to deal with things. I really feel for medical professionals, because if I've had any insight into their lives, it's through that kind of experience. So, I started to get into situations where I'd be at work and I'd start to have panic attacks. And I never had them before, and I didn't know what they were. And it was that thought this thing was behind me, sneaking up on me again all the time. And each scan coming up would trigger that off. And so while I could go through the scanning and the follow-up and everything and just deal with what was going on, I had a whole new set of experiences that I had to learn to deal with around anxiety, around genuine panic attacks that I didn't even know they existed. I knew people talk about it all the time. It's like, yeah, whatever. But I actually had them. And I was, shaking on the floor in the back corner of the toilet cubicle, curled up in a ball like this, having physical reactions to things with no control over it. So I actually enrolled in and did a mindfulness course, part of the research Peter Mac were doing. And so that involved meditation and feeding back on that program. So throughout all of this, anything that I could do to help giving my cancer for research, blood sampling, surveys, I did absolutely everything and still do anything they ask of it, because it's the very least I can do to try and give back. I don't want anyone to go through the same process. And I think I got off light, I was scale of 1 to 10. I was right down the bottom, as it turned out. So, and the impact that had on me, thinking about how that might affect others, was a big part of how I've sort of tried to give back. So, in terms of things like resilience, I think I wasn't very resilient at all. It took me a very long time to come around to it. It wasn't until I had a complete breakdown at work one day, I just realized, had that moment when I realized I needed to actually get someone to help me. Yeah. The thoughts that I had were, none of them were positive. I was sinking deeper and deeper into a hole. I'd lost contact with everything and everybody. Nothing made me happy. Thoughts of my kids didn't mean a thing. Thoughts of my wife or my partner didn't mean anything to me at all.
Was your family aware?
Not particularly. I mean, I talked to my wife about not feeling great about it, but I internalize a lot of things. I'm typical, right? And I deal with a lot of things. I deal with a lot of problems myself. I've always been prideful about being, self-sufficient. And this was a moment where I realized I was way out of my depth. I couldn't do this without some help. So I went to my GP, got a recommendation for a psychologist, and the guy that he recommended for me was perfect, absolutely spot on. He knew how to drill into me and figure out what I needed and read me really well. And he asked me really difficult questions. And so this was in my third year of recovery. I'm finally talking to someone about where I'm at and how I feel and emotions, which I never really had before. Like I've just had this blockage. Yeah.
When you say recovery, third year recovery, does that include things that happen emotionally and psychologically from the cancer, or don't tick you off yet from the cancer, or is it both?
It's a bit of both. I mean, the thing is, they don't tick you off anyway. They put you into a 5-year program. So even if you get to that point where you are cleared, you still have, it depends on your particular routine, but it could be 3 to 5 years of checks. And that's a great thing because they obviously want to make sure if anything does resurface, they pick it up quickly. So it's still there. I've got my next scan next month, which probably will be my last one because I'm over 4.5 years now. So it should be my last scan. So 4.5 years later, I'm still, heading into the center and going through the process. So you kind of, it takes a long time for that to taper off. But for me, it was more the psychological thing. It was literally that huge impact and then not necessarily dealing with it for years later, just having it kind of floating around and revisiting every 3 months. And then realizing, actually, no, you got to go get sorted out because not everything's right here. So with that psychologist, we unpacked a whole bunch of stuff, like even that whole thing about my reaction to it, how that worked, other things that had happened in my life, like, PTSD type responses to things. And that was an interesting thing because, people say these sorts of things, but until someone tells you, no, you actually have what would be diagnosed as PTSD about this event and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other events in your life that you've just been carrying around neatly packaged up in the back of your head somewhere and never dealt with, because that's not what you do. You deal with the facts and the information at hand, and then you move on and you don't, resolve any of it. And that was where the resilience thing for me came out. It took me a really long time to get all of this under control and a whole set of emotions and reactions and responses that I'd never had before. I didn't recognize them. I didn't know what they were, and I certainly didn't know how to deal with it. Anyway, I'm at work every day going through all the usual stuff that happens at work and some other challenging situations there. And of course, that all compounds. So, I just recognized this, and I had an immediate sense of calm after seeing my GP and getting an appointment. I was doing something. I could move again and find a way out of where I was. And so I saw the psychologist for about 12 months, every couple of weeks, whenever it fitted in, or if I felt I needed him sooner, I would get an appointment. And he was fantastic. We, like I said, unpacked a whole bunch of stuff and gave me lots of perspective and understanding about where I was and what I felt and what I was dealing with, and then how to deal with things as well as they come up.
From the first meeting?
Yeah, like literally.
I always get curious about you, man. You better get me right in the first time. I think this is, you're a skeptic, and especially coming from a pretty rigid, blocked out kind of background like yourselves. You're like, come on, what are you going to tell me that I can't work out myself?
Yeah, look, it doesn't always happen. That is true. But my GP nailed it for me. He knew me pretty well. And when I said he and she with my GP because he was away while all of this happened. So I actually got this whole thing kicked off, and I went through the process while he was on holiday. So another GP took over that role while he was there. But with the psychologist, he really picked it up straight away. Very good read, and knew how to talk to me in terms that I would understand. Did a lot of really good digging, and he said, look, you're just straight logic about things. That's what you're like. I'm just going to be really straight up front with you. And everything about what happened worked really well for me and gave me back a sense of perspective and an understanding. And each time I was in there, I'd come out feeling a little bit more released from where I was. So other recommendation, apart from getting any suspect moles checked straight up, because if you can take care of them before any of this stuff might happen, good thing to do, is if you don't, for me, like that was like, oh, I'm a guy, you don't go to psychologist, you're kind of weak, that doesn't happen. No, completely the opposite thing. You do have to find the right psych for you, but they are skilled people, they know what they're doing, the best thing that I did, undid a whole bunch of other things that weren't even related to that incident, and just gave me a better sense of who I was and where I should be going. Heading towards my 50s at the time, I didn't think I'd make it. I did make it, ended up in lockdown during turning 50, so I haven't quite been out to bash that one out for fun. But yeah, it's weird times on top of that in the last year or so for Melbourne, year and a half for Melbourne. It was all, been an interesting couple of years, but you can get through it. You can, if you do your best, let me get rid of that. You can do your best, but use the people who are available to you. You know, the more you do with that, the more support you get. Friends like Daz, just those coaching moments, those talking about experiences, having someone you can unload with. I think for guys particularly, we don't generally do that on a regular basis, but if you just swallow your pride and let it out, because if you bottle it up, it'll make things absolutely worse.
You said you came from a line of GPs and people around you that act so robotically. Have you noticed them be interested in the way you surely would have changed in their eyes in terms of what you've gone through, or do you keep the mask on when you're around them again? But
interesting question. The mask is definitely lowered. You know, it's not quite the same as it was. Yeah, they do. But I still have that response to a lot of things, and that in itself isn't. And this is one of the things I learned from my psychologist too. Is like, that's not a bad thing. You've just got to make sure that when you do that, and that's a useful tool, that when you finish with that tool, you put it away, and then you think about what's happened and deal with what's gone afterwards. Don't just put the tools back on the shelf and keep going. You need to stop and consider and think about what it was and allow yourself to feel things about it. So there were lots of little tips and trainings and little keywords and phrases throughout that whole sort of 12-month period of seeing him that to this day, when if I do get into that sort of space again, it does happen. You have occasional moments of it.
Yeah.
I can deal with it fairly quickly and let it go, and hopefully, be a bit more normal about things.
What was the impact on your family through this whole journey, and anything that was concerning from, obviously having to worry about yourself and look after yourself, but also noticing that they're probably at some breaking points as well, I'd assume?
Yeah, actually not really. We kept most of it reasonably quiet. I mean, there were a number of people around me who didn't even know this was going on. And I think because of what you don't know about your cancer, it's often better not to sort of open up conversations, because you'll get asked questions that you can't answer. And that doesn't necessarily make you feel better, or, you try and you lose all control about everything, right? It's you are, flying blind, and everything in your life, it just sort of falls away from being a structure that you've put together, because none of it matters anymore. It could all just end right now. It's like a super, super slow car crash, right? Because you can't do anything about it. You can just see it going on. And that becomes really draining. So sometimes not talking about it is good. You got to pick your people. So with my wife, I would tell her about how I was feeling, and she was the one who said, "You're going to your GP, you're going to go and get a psychologist, you're going to go and do this, and I'm going to make you do it if you don't do it," right? So she was extremely supportive all the way through. She got the full story. She gets the full story. She got the full story, every little bit. The one time that I did emotionally lose it, and it only did happen to me once, I was with her when that happened, and we went through the whole thing together, and she supported me all through recovery. I was propped up in bed with tubes and stuff at home for a couple of weeks, because that's the way things happen now. So, she was my nurse. She was, fed me everything, did everything for me, and supported me completely through the whole thing. And that took a toll on her as well. And in fact, we both went to see my psychologist together in that sort of second part, to talk about our relationship and why we were maybe not in the best place we were. And that was great, because there have been stresses on us, and we were not together in the best place we should be. And we've been together for 25-something years, 26 years. So he actually looked at both of us and said, "Okay, this is what I see." And so we did a couple of sessions together with him, and it really reset us as well, got us back to normal. The kids, we didn't tell them a lot. We figured that there wasn't too much to tell, and making them worry about their dad was not going to be beneficial to them because of all the unknowns. Kids are going to ask you questions, and if you can't answer them, they're not going to be any wiser or happier or anything about that. So we just told them little snippets on the way through, coming home with all of these stitches and staples and stuff, that needed explaining. But, that's a bit harder to cover up. But, mostly it was deciding whether this was something at which stage we should tell them and how much. And you get a read on that with your kids about, whether they're going to take that. And, I'd be halfway through telling them something, and they'd be, it's like, all right, they're drifting off. They're not interested. That's fine. We'll stop the conversation now and go, "Yeah, I'm okay. Don't worry." I go, can I go back and play now? It's like, yeah, sure. And that's really what you want to see. You don't want to be digging holes for them and making things difficult for them if they don't need it.
Yeah.
Not at that stage. They've got plenty of time to learn how to deal with things in their lives. But I think it's just a responsibility thing too. So we didn't have to go to that level with them. So we chose not to. Unfortunately, we didn't have to go any deeper with it. It was just taking them through that process and explaining a few things.
I've got a comment that just popped up on the chat, and it's from someone that's had cancer herself, and also her daughter got cancer. She's a good friend of mine. She said, thanks for sharing your experience, Jeremy. Such an encouragement. It would be great if health professionals talked more about psychological and emotional effects post-treatment. You've got some great advice to share.
Yeah, look, it's I think it's something that we're only getting to now as a community. You're having a lot more discussion about mental health, and mental health not being like being a fitness freak kind of mental health, but mental health in general. I mean, how you just deal with things and get through daily life, because there are challenges all the time, right? It can be financial, it can be family, it can be relationship, whole bunch of things. And I think Australia's got a tradition of not dealing with stuff. She'll be right, mate, and we're tough and all that kind of stuff. So that conversation, opening it up, having a chat about it. And I think for people like myself, admitting that you can't do it alone is a really big turning point. Yep. If you've become self-dependent over the years, if you are the kind of person who deals with your own problems and fixes your own stuff, and that's something that you do and enjoy doing. There's nothing wrong with saying, hey, this one's too big for me to deal with, and I would apply that logic in other things that I have interests in. I just never applied it to me.
It's huge, Jez. You make this interview go well because you're such a good speaker, mate. I was like...
I get told I talk too much, so hopefully it wasn't too bad.
Nah, too much when you cover the whole situation. It's really great. There's no need for me to speak. People hear me speak for 3 hours a day. It's great to know that you've got some clarity and you've fought through some pretty dubious and unknown moments to still fight for that clarity, and not everything's it's still in the air, and it seems like you've got a lot more peace around it, which is what we're all after, isn't it? Amongst the storm and the unknown, we need to settle somehow.
Yeah, it's a great term, looking for peace amongst it. Yeah, the calm within this storm. And it doesn't really matter what you're going through. Like, it doesn't have to be the world's biggest incident. For me, it was a potentially really big one that ended up just falling off a cliff literally and becoming easier and easier to deal with. But it was that initial hit that triggered off a whole bunch of other stuff. So I guess the learning from that is don't underrate what happens to you. Small things can be traumatic in their own ways. And if you don't deal with them, if you just bank all that stuff up, you end up with a larger pile of stuff to deal with later on. So it is a better thing to go and seek help straight away. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign that you're incompetent or unable to do things. You're a human being, and remarkably, we all work better together. It's a weird thing, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, and there are people out there who have a lot of very specific experience and knowledge who can guide you as well. I think that's the other thing too. It's not just seeing a psych and letting it out. It's the guidance you can get from people to coping with things, dealing with things as well. Two different things. Coping is one thing. Dealing with it is another thing altogether. Because we all want to get back to that normal state where, I still say to my wife that I've forgotten how to be happy about a lot of things. And I haven't quite recovered that. So I'm not sure whether I really had it in the first place, to be honest. I think it might have been something from that upbringing where happiness is not what I think it is. And I'm still not sure I've actually found this sense of being happy. Wow. I do get satisfaction from certain things, but that's what it is, I might acquire a new object like a BMX, and I feel really good about that. It has nostalgia and a whole bunch of stuff, but am I actually happy within myself about things? I don't know. I'm not sure I've got back to that stage, or if I was even started at that stage. So
you maybe need to drop in the Paran bowl backwards or something on the bike and release that inner kid back out to the hounds again.
I'll tell you one thing about getting older, mate. It takes a lot longer to heal up.
It does.
And you can feel like you've dropped into a concrete skate bowl on your head just getting out of bed in the morning. I mean, no one tells you that when you're a kid, right?
I know.
This is what you can look forward to in the second half of your life. You're just going to hurt for no reason. you're going to get up with a back problem that didn't exist when you went to bed.
there's no way to communicate that to the younger kids. And we've been now, you said you're in your 50s, which you're looking incredibly well for your 50s, man.
I had a good facelift.
But they don't listen. And
no, they can't. They can't understand it.
And I remember what the oldies who were 30 or something when you were 9, you go away, you old fuddy. Like there's never any meeting point. It's still like, all right, you're gonna get older, you're gonna hurt yourself, brush your teeth are gonna fall out like this. Like,
yeah, I still have trouble dealing with the fact that I'm an adult. Secondly, I'm a father. At least there's evidence of that. Apparently, if I'm to believe their mind. And in my head, I still feel like I could drop into that bowl in Paran. I'd go and do it tomorrow. Although I'd have that bit now that sort of, decades of experience has said to me, you're not going to get this right, right? I've got enough experience now to hold me back on those things. But I don't feel any older in my head than I did when I was in my teens enjoying the 80s. I don't feel any mentally older than that. I just have other responsibilities that I have to deal with. So yeah, the body's getting older. I don't think my mind's particularly aging terribly well. I'm still acting like a teenage kid.
I didn't touch on this with Jay, our first guest, but my guest yesterday was my mum, and you've just touched on it again. There is certainly some theming around being childlike and resilience.
Yeah, I like that whole thing, about growing up and growing old.
Yeah.
That you're going to grow old, but you don't necessarily have to grow up. I think there's a certain, if you have that, and I'm a little bit like that. I'm still, impulsive about certain things. I still get obsessive about things. I've still got characteristics. They're not going to change. That's me. But, I try not to, let that side of things go. I figure if you stop thinking young, you can accept that you're older and experienced, but if you stop thinking young, it makes a big difference.
Totally.
I'm not a 50-year-old like my dad was a 50-year-old.
Yes, yeah.
We're just not the same.
Yeah.
And he's, late 70s now, hitting 80. I'm not going to be like that at 80. I'll still be trying to ride that BMX in the skate bowl when I'm 80 because nothing's changed in my head, and I can't see that it probably will.
Just chuck a Band-Aid on it, go get a roll up out of the cupboard and hit it.
Yeah, take some risks, but hey, we've got to be a bit more calculated about them now.
Put the knee pads and elbow pads on. Hey, Jez, I really appreciate you coming on and telling us what's up. Every situation's important to hear, and you've unravelled it so well for us in such a impactful, short 35 minutes. It's very impressive, man. And
cool.
I'm glad to hear you're still a big kid, still some big kids in amongst us.
Yeah, well, we probably hang out with mostly big kids, right?
We've got another big kid coming up in about 20 minutes, so I better get out of here and make room for him. Really appreciate your time, Jez, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks, mate. And thank everyone else.
Thanks, mate.